They looked at the raw data and said the two drivers were from a different planet. The most experienced hand in the garage called it possibly the strongest pairing there had ever been, ever. And an engineer who had watched a generation of talent come and go looked at the first test and thought, this is going to be a fight. They were describing a team that would tear itself apart in a single season. In 2007, the McLaren of Woking put the best driver in the world in one car and a 22-year-old rookie in the other. The best driver in the world was Fernando Alonso, the reigning double world champion, the man who had just ended the reign of Michael Schumacher. The rookie had never started a Grand Prix in his life. By November, the champion was gone, the team had been thrown out of the Constructors' Championship, and the title had slipped away by a single point. One man had seen it coming before anyone else in that garage. He saw it in the first months, and he spent the rest of the year trying to make the team act on it. Nobody listened. They thought they were watching a spoiled champion. They were watching a warning. So what did Fernando Alonso understand about Lewis Hamilton in 2007 that the rest of the world refused to hear? That is exactly what we are here to find out. To understand the warning, start with the man giving it, because his credibility was total. Fernando Alonso did not arrive at McLaren as a hopeful. He arrived as the reigning emperor of the sport. 2 consecutive world championships in 2005 and 2006, both won against Schumacher and Ferrari at the peak of their powers. He was the man who had broken the longest era of dominance the sport had ever known, and he had done it before his 26th birthday. He was 25 years old, and by common consent, he was the finest racing driver alive. He signed a 3-year contract with McLaren to build a dynasty around himself. There was only one detail he had not chosen: the driver in the other car. McLaren had spent years raising a young Englishman inside its own driver program, and for 2007, it promoted him straight into the second seat. Lewis Hamilton was 22. He had won everything in the junior categories, but he had never turned a wheel in a Formula One race. To the paddock, that made him the apprentice, the junior partner, the number 2 who would learn at the master's shoulder. Alonso did not see an apprentice. When the pairing was confirmed, he is said to have asked the team boss, Ron Dennis, a single cutting question. Did McLaren no longer want to win the Constructors' Championship? It sounded like arrogance. It was arithmetic. 2 equally fast cars taking points off each other hand the title to whichever team was disciplined enough to pick a leader. Alonso had done that math before the season even began. Nobody wanted to do it with him. And then the cars rolled out for the first test, and the people holding the stopwatches went very quiet. Pedro Della Rozza was McLaren's test driver that season, the man paid to read the raw telemetry of both cars. He looked at the numbers Alonso and Hamilton were producing and reached for the only comparison that fit. These guys, he said, are from a different planet. That driver pairing, he added, was possibly the strongest there had ever been. Ever. The rookie was not being carried. He was setting a pace that forced a double world champion to stretch. Then the season began, and the record book started to bend. In Melbourne, on the 18th of March, 2007, Lewis Hamilton finished 3rd on his debut, on the podium in his very first Grand Prix. And he did not stop. He stood on the podium at the next race and the next and the one after that. 9 races into a Formula One career, he had 9 consecutive podiums, something no rookie in the history of the sport had ever done. By the end of the year, he had 12, breaking a rookie record that had stood since 1996. 4 wins, matching the most any rookie had ever taken in a single season. 6 pole positions, 12 starts from the front row of the grid, another mark no first-year driver had ever reached. 109 points, the most any first-year driver had ever scored, and scored under an old system that paid less for winning than the sport does now. He was not simply fast on his best afternoon. He was relentless on every one of them. Read that again. A rookie against the best driver in the world in identical machinery, and there was nothing to choose between them. Hamilton understood precisely what he was up against. It always felt, he admitted later, that he had to work twice as hard because Alonso was so quick. He had to be at least a 1/10 of a second faster, a 1/10 and a bit, just to be ahead of him. That is the measure of it. To stay in front of the rookie, the 2-time champion had to be perfect. And the rookie kept finding the 10th. The first crack ran through Monaco. On the 27th of May, 2007, McLaren finished 1 and 2 on the streets of Monte Carlo. Alonso first, Hamilton second. It should have been the team's proudest afternoon. It became the day the garage split in 2. The instruction from the pit wall was simple. Steve Hallam, the race engineer, described the deal without any drama. Everybody turns the engines down, hold position to the end, and that is the finishing order. Alonso did as he was told. Hamilton did not accept it. He closed right up onto the back of his teammate, and the champion, feeling the pressure, turned his engine back up and edged away again. Hamilton believed he had been held back from a race he could have won, and he did not trouble to hide it. Afterwards, asked whether he was satisfied with second place, the 22-year-old gave an answer that told the whole story. "Well," he said, "that is why I have got number 2 on my car. The only way to get past," he added, "is to apply pressure." A rookie had just informed a double world champion in public that he had no intention of staying behind him. This was the warning becoming visible. Alonso had told the team that Hamilton would never be a supporting act, and here was Hamilton refusing the supporting role on the most famous circuit in the world. The champion had been right. Being right did not help him. It only made the team's choice harder and the resentment deeper. And in Hungary, that resentment stopped being private. By midsummer, 2007 had become 2 championships running at once, one on the track and one inside the McLaren garage. 3 moments defined the second one. The first was Hungary, the 4th of August. In qualifying, Hamilton refused a team instruction to let Alonso through. Alonso answered in kind. At the final pit stop, he sat in the box a handful of seconds too long, just long enough to stop Hamilton from starting one last flying lap. The stewards ruled it deliberate. They stripped Alonso of his pole position with a 5-place grid penalty, and they ruled that McLaren would score no constructors' points that weekend at all. A team had just been punished for a war between its own drivers. The second moment happened away from the cameras. That season, McLaren was already drowning in a scandal the world came to call Spygate. 780 pages of confidential Ferrari documents had been found in the hands of its chief designer. The affair would end with the largest fine in the history of sport, $100 million, and the team stripped out of the Constructors' Championship altogether. In the heat of the Hungary fallout, Alonso reminded Ron Dennis that he held emails of his own that could deepen the team's exposure. The reigning world champion and his own team principal were now negotiating under threat. The third moment was a single sentence. After the penultimate race, in China, Dennis is reported to have told Alonso exactly where the team stood. "Our race," he said, "is not with Massa, it is with Fernando." Read that again. The team principal had just named his own driver as the enemy. Alonso later put it as plainly as it can be put. "It was a team," he said, with its eyes totally on one side of the garage. "When your team says that, you cannot continue." Here is the part of the story that does not fit the headlines. The warning was true, and being the man who gave it wrecked his season and shadowed the rest of his career. While the 2 McLaren drivers fought each other, the championship quietly walked out of the door toward a third man. In China, on the 7th of October, Lewis Hamilton led the title race and needed only to finish. In drying condition, McLaren left him out too long on worn wet tires, and as he crept into the pit entry, his car simply slid off the road and beached itself in the gravel, in front of the entire world. It was the first retirement of his career, and it arrived with the title in his hands. He would call it a moment that still makes him sick to this day. 2 weeks later, at the finale in Brazil, on the 21st of October, a gearbox glitch dropped Hamilton to the back of the field. He fought his way back to 7th. It was not enough. Kimi Raikkonen, the Ferrari driver the 2 McLarens had spent the whole year ignoring, won the race and the championship. The final margin was 1 point, not 1 point over Hamilton alone, 1 point over both of them. Hamilton and Alonso finished the season locked together on 109 points each, and the crown went to the driver whose team had been willing to choose a leader. Alonso had predicted this precise outcome in a meeting the previous autumn. It gave him no protection at all. Within 2 weeks of the finale, McLaren and Alonso agreed to part, 1 year into a 3-year contract. The British press had spent the season casting him as the villain, the jealous champion who could not bear to be matched by an English boy in an English team. That version stuck. Almost nobody wrote the other one, that the finest driver of his generation had walked into the wrong garage, told the truth too early, and been thrown out for it. From that winter, Alonso's championship stopped. Twice more he would come agonizingly close, runner-up with Ferrari in 2010 and again in 2012, each time losing the crown in the final race of the year by a handful of points. But he never again held the title he had owned on the day he walked into McLaren. He would not win another. Not the next year, and not in the 18 that followed. So who was right? The standings had already delivered the plainest verdict of all. Identical points, 109 apiece. Identical tallies where the season was decided. There had never been a junior partner in that team, and the numbers said so in a language no press conference could argue with. And in the years afterward, the people who had been inside that garage answered too, one by one. Ron Dennis, the principal who had backed the rookie, eventually admitted the boy had not been an innocent bystander. Hamilton, he said, was a young guy, understandably perceived by many as the chosen one, but also someone who carried a certain immaturity. Lewis, Dennis conceded, had his role to play in starting the process that escalated. The man who had chosen the rookie over the champion was years later handing some of the blame back to the rookie. Even Pedro de la Rosa, who had watched both cars from the inside, framed the season not as a failure of one driver, but as the collision of two of the fastest men the sport had ever put in the same team. Fernando Alonso, for his part, has never stopped insisting the record was twisted. No one, he said, ever heard his version or the truth or the facts. He never held anyone up in Hungary, he maintained. They simply gave him old tires in qualifying. And in the strangest detail of the entire affair, it was his own team that lodged a protest against him. The first time in the history of the sport, he said, that such a thing had ever happened. And Hamilton, who had every reason to belittle the man he had fought, did the opposite. Asked years later to measure the drivers he had raced, he reached back to his very first teammate. Alonso, he said, was arguably the greatest driver he had ever raced against. Consider the weight of that. The 7-time world champion, naming the man who warned the world about him as the finest he ever faced. What Fernando Alonso had seen in the opening months of 2007 was not a promising rookie. It was the most successful driver Formula One would ever produce. The 22-year-old in the other car went on to win the world championship the very next season. On the final corner of the final lap, the youngest champion in the sport's history at the time. Then he won it again and again until he had 7 world titles and 105 Grand Prix victories, more than any driver who has ever lived. That was the thing in the other half of the garage. That was what Alonso had been trying to tell them. Do not treat this one as a number 2, because this one will take everything. He was right in every detail, and it cost him everything. The best driver of his generation gave the clearest warning of his career. And the only people who could have acted on it decided he was simply frightened of the boy. He was not frightened. He was early. And in this sport, being early and being ignored look exactly the same, right up until the record book is written. If stories from inside the garage deserve to be told with the evidence instead of the myth, follow along because the next legend is already waiting on the grid. Then leave a comment with your verdict. Was Fernando Alonso a jealous champion in 2007? Or the only man in that team who could already see the future? The car numbers faded, the contracts expired, and the record did what the record always does. One man warned them, the other won everything. And the sport is still deciding which of the two it was ever really listening to.